July 8th, 1944. The cliffs at Marpi Point, northern Saipan. Corporal Kenneth Miller of the 4th Marine Division stood 200 yards from the edge, his rifle lowered, watching something that made no tactical sense. Japanese families clustered at the cliff's edge, mothers holding children, elderly men gripping grenades, entire bloodlines gathered at the precipice above jagged rocks and churning surf. Through his field glasses, Miller saw a young mother raise her infant above her head, preparing to throw. Behind him, a loudspeaker crackled to life. Private First Class Guy Gabaldon, a Mexican-American who had learned Japanese from friends in Los Angeles, began shouting in carefully pronounced phrases, "Surrender! We will not harm you! The war is over here!" His voice echoed across the volcanic rock. Some families hesitated, others jumped. Miller watched bodies fall, heard the distant impact, and felt his stomach turn. Then something changed. One woman stepped back from the edge, then another. A father clutched his children close and turned toward the American lines instead of the sea. What happened at Marpi Point in the final days of Saipan became the Pacific War's most haunting paradox. American soldiers racing against propaganda and terror to save the families they were never supposed to meet, begging people to live when everything they had been taught commanded them to die. The Battle of Saipan had been declared secure on July 9th, but the most desperate fight was just beginning. A battle fought not with bullets, but with words, a frantic effort by Marines and Nisei interpreters to convince terrified civilians that the enemy, who had been painted as demons, were the only ones trying to save them from the death their own leaders demanded. The Battle of Saipan had been declared secure on July 9th, but the most desperate fight was just beginning. A battle fought not with bullets, but with words, a frantic effort by Marines and Nisei interpreters to convince terrified civilians that the enemy who had been painted as demons were the only ones trying to save them from the death their own leaders demanded. July 7th, 1944. The northern cliffs of Saipan, 800 feet above the Pacific. Corporal Kenneth Miller stood at the base of what would later be called Suicide Cliff, his binoculars trained on the ridgeline above. Hundreds of Japanese civilians clustered at the precipice. Women in torn dresses clutched infants to their chests. Elderly men gripped Type 97 hand grenades, fingers hovering near the pins. Children stood silent, absorbing a terror they were too young to articulate. Behind them, Japanese soldiers in tattered uniforms moved through the crowd, not herding them away from the edge, but toward it, enforcing with bayonets and commands what propaganda had already written into their minds. Miller watched a young mother step to the very edge, her baby wrapped in cloth against her chest. She looked down at the jagged rocks and churning surf, below, then back at the American positions. For a moment she seemed to hesitate, then she jumped. Her scream was swallowed by the wind and the sound of waves crashing 800 feet below. Miller lowered his binoculars. His hands were shaking. This horror had been months in the making. Since early 1944, Japanese military authorities had saturated Saipan with propaganda designed to terrorize the civilian population. Radio broadcasts claimed that American soldiers mutilated Japanese war dead for sport, that they raped women and devoured children, that capture meant torture beyond imagination. The propaganda was systematic and relentless, documented in captured Japanese military communications and later confirmed through civilian testimony preserved in the National Archives. Families were issued grenades with explicit instructions on how to use them if Americans approached. Death was presented not as a tragedy, but as an honor, the only acceptable response to potential capture. The doctrine was called Gyokusai, the shattering of the jewel. It glorified suicide as the ultimate demonstration of loyalty to the emperor, transforming the natural human instinct for survival into a source of shame. Mothers who loved their children were convinced that killing them was an act of protection. that a quick death from a grenade or a fall from a cliff was mercy compared to what Americans would do. Fear and duty had been weaponized into a mass death cult, and now the final command was being executed on the cliffs of Marpi Point. Miller's company had pushed north through fierce resistance for 3 weeks. They had fought Japanese soldiers who refused to surrender, who charged American positions with bayonets fixed to bamboo poles when their ammunition ran out, but nothing in their training had prepared them for this. Watching families jump from cliffs violated every assumption about warfare. These weren't combatants. They were mothers and children choosing death because they believed Americans were monsters. Some Marines broke down crying. Others stood frozen in helpless rage. Artillery fire and grenades could eliminate enemy positions, but they were useless against an enemy who had already decided to die. The casualties mounting on those cliffs weren't from American weapons. They were from 3 years of lies, systematically delivered, perfectly designed to make surrender seem worse than death. 2 miles to the west, at another promontory called Banzai Cliff, the scene repeated. Families gathered at the edge overlooking the ocean. Some tied themselves together before jumping, ensuring that death would claim entire bloodlines at once. Japanese soldiers shot civilians who hesitated or tried to retreat. The propaganda machine had convinced an entire population that Americans were devils, and now that belief was writing itself in blood on volcanic rock. But in the chaos and horror, something unexpected happened. Some families hesitated, some children cried and pulled away from the edge. Some mothers looked at their infants and couldn't complete the final act. These moments of doubt, brief as they were, opened a window of opportunity that a handful of Americans were about to crawl through. But in the chaos and horror, something unexpected happened. Some families hesitated. Some children cried and pulled away from the edge. Some mothers looked at their infants and couldn't complete the final act. These moments of doubt, brief as they were, opened a window of opportunity that a handful of Americans were about to crawl through. July 8, 1944. Morning light broke over the cliffs as Private First Class Guy Gabaldon grabbed a handheld loudspeaker and began walking toward positions where Japanese civilians had gathered overnight. His commanding officer, Captain John Schwaber, watched in disbelief as the 18-year-old Marine approached the cliff area alone, unarmed except for the voice equipment and a bag of rations. No one had ordered this approach. No tactical manual suggested it. Gabaldon was improvising based on instinct, language skills, and a childhood that had prepared him for this moment in ways the Marine Corps never could. Gabaldon had grown up poor in East Los Angeles, bouncing between foster homes until a Japanese-American family, the Nakanos, took him in. He learned Japanese not in a classroom, but on the streets of Boyle Heights, speaking the casual dialect of second-generation immigrants. He picked up colloquialisms, slang, and the informal rhythms of everyday conversation. While military interpreters studied formal Japanese suitable for diplomatic correspondence, Gabaldon had absorbed the language people actually spoke to each other, to their families, their children, their friends. He raised the loudspeaker and began talking, not shouting orders or making official pronouncements, but speaking as if addressing neighbors. He used simple words, familiar phrases, the kind of Japanese a mother would understand instantly. "You don't have to die," he said. "The Americans will not hurt you. We have food. We have doctors. Your children can live." His voice echoed off the volcanic rock, carrying across the precipice where families stood frozen between life and death. Minutes passed. Then a woman stepped back from the edge. She held her child close and turned toward the sound of Gabaldon's voice. Then another family moved away from the cliff. An elderly man lowered the grenade he had been clutching. One by one, they began walking down the slope toward American lines. Gabaldon kept talking, maintaining the same calm, conversational tone. When the first family reached him, he handed them water canteens and tins of rations. Navy corpsmen rushed forward with medical supplies. Gabaldon realized something in that moment that would define his entire campaign on Saipan. His street-level Japanese was more persuasive than formal military translation, precisely because it didn't sound official. It sounded human. Propaganda had painted Americans as inhuman monsters, but monsters didn't speak casual Japanese learned from friends in Los Angeles. Monsters didn't use the same phrases Japanese mothers used with their children. His language created cognitive dissonance that broke through the fear, just enough to make some families reconsider the choice they had been commanded to make. By mid-morning, Gabaldon had convinced dozens of civilians to surrender. Some he persuaded to return to caves where others were hiding, using them as intermediaries to spread the message that Americans were offering safety, not torture. When 2 Japanese soldiers emerged and surrendered to him, Gabaldon sent them back into the cave systems with a proposal: bring everyone out, and no one would be harmed. An hour later, a Japanese officer appeared at the cave entrance. Behind him came hundreds more, soldiers and civilians mixed together, emerging into daylight instead of choosing death in darkness. Captain Schwaber would later document that on July 8th alone, Gabaldon brought in over 800 prisoners and rescued civilians, the largest single surrender of Japanese forces to an individual soldier in the Pacific War. His superiors gave him the nickname the Pied Piper of Saipan, but Gabaldon understood the fragile nature of his success. Every person he convinced to surrender was a minor miracle, a temporary victory over months of systematic indoctrination. Because even as some families walked towards safety, Japanese soldiers loyal to the death doctrine were shooting civilians who attempted to surrender. Hundreds more remained at the cliffs, still convinced that death was honor and survival was shame. Gabaldon's voice could only reach so far, and time was running out. Because even as some families walked towards safety, Japanese soldiers loyal to the death doctrine were shooting civilians who attempted to surrender. Hundreds more remained at the cliffs, still convinced that death was honor and survival was shame. Gabaldon's voice could only reach so far, and time was running out. July 9th, 1944. Dawn broke over northern Saipan with a different kind of urgency. What had begun as Gabaldon's improvised solo rescue mission was now being systematized into a coordinated operation involving hundreds of Marines. Loudspeaker teams from both the 2nd and 4th Marine Divisions spread across the cliff areas, establishing positions at multiple points along the northern coast. Each team consisted of a Nisei interpreter, a Marine rifleman for protection, and equipment operators managing the portable broadcast systems. Their orders were simple but unprecedented: convince Japanese civilians to surrender before they killed themselves or were killed by their own soldiers. Navy Corpsman Robert Hayes set up an aid station at the base of Suicide Cliff, deliberately positioned in clear view of the families above. He erected a large Red Cross flag on a bamboo pole and laid out medical supplies on white sheets. The visual message was as important as the spoken appeals echoing from the loudspeakers. This was theatre designed to contradict propaganda, a demonstration that Americans brought medicine instead of torture, food instead of starvation. But the operation was anything but safe. Japanese soldiers still controlled pockets throughout the cliff areas, and they had orders to prevent civilian surrender at any cost. Snipers fired at the loudspeaker teams. Marines providing security returned fire while interpreters continued broadcasting appeals. Staff Sergeant David Akwi, a Nisei soldier from Hawaii, crouched behind volcanic rock as bullets struck inches from his position. He kept talking into the microphone, his voice steady despite the rounds impacting around him. The rescue operation was documented by combat correspondents who moved with the Marine units, capturing both written accounts and photographs that would later be preserved in Marine Corps Historical Division archives. They recorded the establishment of safe corridors marked with white flags, pathways where civilians could descend from the cliff areas without being shot by confused Marines who might mistake them for attacking soldiers. The corridors required constant coordination via radio to ensure all units understood which approaches were designated safe zones. Throughout the morning, the results began accumulating. A family of 6 emerged from a cave near Marpi Point, guided by a Nisei interpreter's voice. 3 elderly women descended from Banzai Cliff, clutching each other for support. A group of 20 civilians approached an aid station, children crying with relief as corpsmen distributed water and crackers. By noon, hundreds had been convinced to surrender. Hayes's aid station treated malnutrition, dehydration, shrapnel wounds, and the psychological trauma of 3 weeks living in caves, believing that capture meant death. The moral mathematics of the operation were staggering. Every civilian saved represented a victory more profound than any tactical objective secured by artillery or infantry assault. These were lives that propaganda had marked for death, families that Japanese military doctrine considered expendable in service of national honor. American Marines were proving that even in total war, mercy remained possible, that military operations could prioritize saving enemy civilians over simply eliminating them as obstacles. Yet the victories came with haunting counterpoints. While loudspeakers saved hundreds at accessible locations, mass suicides continued at isolated cliff areas beyond the reach of the broadcast equipment. Japanese soldiers executed civilians who attempted to surrender in areas where Marines couldn't provide protection. Some families completed their suicide pacts moments before rescue teams arrived, choosing death, while American voices calling them to safety echoed across the rocks. Combat correspondents documented Marines standing helpless, watching. Families jumped from cliffs too distant for intervention, their screams carrying across the water. Lieutenant Robert Van Dusen, observing from offshore aboard USS Twining, watched through binoculars as the tragedy unfolded across multiple cliff positions simultaneously. He could see Marines with loudspeakers pleading with families, some civilians walking towards safety, others jumping despite the appeals. The scene captured the entire campaign's moral complexity, rescue and suicide happening side by side, salvation and tragedy separated by mere yards, and the fragile psychology of propaganda-driven terror. By the evening of July 9th, when Vice Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner declared Saipan officially secured, the rescue operations were far from finished. Hundreds of civilians remained hidden in caves throughout the Northern Highlands. The work would continue for days, then weeks. But the pattern had been established. American forces had demonstrated that their enemy's propaganda was lies. The question was whether that demonstration had come early enough to save the thousands still convinced that death was the only honorable choice. By the evening of July 9th, when Vice Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner declared Saipan officially secured, the rescue operations were far from finished. Hundreds of civilians remained hidden in caves throughout the Northern Highlands. The work would continue for days, then weeks. But the pattern had been established. American forces had demonstrated that their enemy's propaganda was lies. The question was whether that demonstration had come early enough to save the thousands still convinced that death was the only honorable choice. To understand why Japanese families stood at cliff edges preparing to die, one had to look back 18 months to when the architecture of fear was first constructed. The tragedy at Saipan's cliffs didn't happen spontaneously. It was engineered systematically and deliberately by Japanese military authorities who understood that terror could be as effective as bullets in achieving strategic objectives. The campaign began in early 1943 when Japanese commanders recognized that Saipan would inevitably become a battlefield. Rather than evacuate the civilian population or prepare defensive shelters, they launched a propaganda operation designed to ensure that civilians would choose death over surrender. Captured Japanese military documents, preserved in the National Archives and analyzed by researchers at Japan's National Institute for Defense Studies, reveal the systematic nature of the indoctrination. Radio broadcasts from Tokyo repeated fabricated atrocity stories throughout 1943 and early 1944. Americans, the broadcasts claimed, had massacred civilians on Guadalcanal and mutilated corpses for trophies. They raped women publicly before killing them. They tortured children to extract information about military positions. These stories were pure fiction, designed specifically to terrorize. But repetition made them believable. When the same lies were broadcast daily for months, supported by official military sources, civilians had no reason to doubt their truth. The propaganda escalated from radio to direct indoctrination. Japanese military officers visited schools across Saipan, conducting assemblies where they described American atrocities in graphic detail. Children as young as 6 were taught that capture meant torture. Teachers, themselves indoctrinated, reinforced these lessons in daily instruction. The education system became an instrument of terror, preparing the next generation not for survival, but for honorable death. Community meetings were made mandatory. Village leaders, operating under military supervision, distributed Type 97 hand grenades to families with explicit instructions. 1 grenade per household. Pull the pin if Americans approach. Die together as a family unit. The grenades were presented not as weapons of last resort, but as tools of honor, physical manifestations of loyalty to the emperor. Families that accepted the grenades believed they were protecting their children from something worse. This weaponization of protective instinct was the propaganda's cruelest element. Parents who loved their children were convinced that killing them was an act of love. The natural human desire to shield offspring from harm was twisted into a mechanism for murder-suicide. Japanese commanders understood cultural psychology well enough to know that parents would die for their children, so they created a narrative where killing children became the ultimate parental sacrifice. The doctrine underpinning this operation was gyokusai, the shattering of the jewel. The term came from ancient Chinese poetry, symbolizing death before dishonor, the destruction of something precious rather than allowing its capture. Japanese military culture had elevated gyokusai to a supreme virtue, particularly as the war turned against them. If victory was impossible, then honorable annihilation was preferable to shameful survival. This philosophy, originally intended for soldiers, was extended to civilians on islands that would become battlefields. Japanese commanders believed civilian mass suicide would serve strategic purposes. It would demonstrate Japanese resolve, showing Americans that the empire would fight to literal extinction rather than surrender. It would demoralize American forces by creating scenes of horror that contradicted their self-image as liberators. And it would eliminate the logistical burden of managing captured civilian populations on contested islands. Terror, therefore, became policy. Propaganda became weaponry. Culture itself was militarized in service of strategic objectives. Understanding how this system was constructed didn't make the cliff suicides less tragic. It made them more horrifying. These deaths weren't the inevitable result of combat. They were manufactured outcomes, casualties of a propaganda campaign as deliberate as any artillery barrage. Thousands of Japanese civilians died on Saipan's cliffs, not because Americans threatened them, but because their own government had convinced them that Americans were demons. The lies killed as efficiently as bullets, and no amount of post-war analysis could bring those families back or undo the choice they had been taught to make. Understanding how this system was constructed didn't make the cliff suicides less tragic. It made them more horrifying. These deaths weren't the inevitable result of combat. They were manufactured outcomes, casualties of a propaganda campaign as deliberate as any artillery barrage. Thousands of Japanese civilians died on Saipan's cliffs, not because Americans threatened them, but because their own government had convinced them that Americans were demons. The lies killed as efficiently as bullets, and no amount of post-war analysis could bring those families back or undo the choice they had been taught to make. July 10th, 1944. 2 miles inland from the cliffs, Corporal James Reed crouched outside a cave entrance in the limestone hills north of Mount Tapachau. He could hear them inside, children crying, adults whispering in Japanese, the shuffle of bodies against stone. The cave mouth had been partially collapsed, deliberately sealed from within. Reed faced a choice that had become grimly familiar during the final week of fighting. Standard doctrine said to call out once, wait 30 seconds, then use grenades or flamethrowers to clear the cave. But the sounds coming from inside weren't the movements of soldiers preparing defensive positions. They were families hiding in darkness. Saipan's volcanic terrain was honeycombed with caves, natural formations carved by centuries of rainfall through porous limestone. During the 3-week battle, these caves had served dual purposes: defensive positions for Japanese soldiers and hiding places for terrified civilians. The problem for American forces was that the two were often indistinguishable. A cave might shelter armed defenders who would fight to the death, or it might contain families clutching grenades they'd been ordered to use on themselves. Marine units advancing through the northern highlands had developed brutal but tactically necessary cave-clearing procedures. They used combinations of flamethrowers and demolition charges to eliminate resistance, or sealed caves with explosives if clearing them seemed too costly in American lives. But these tactics, designed for combat, killed civilians who couldn't be distinguished from soldiers in the darkness. Marines who later entered caves after using explosives discovered bodies of children alongside soldiers, families who had been hiding in chambers indistinguishable from fighting positions. Reed made a decision that violated every safety protocol. He set down his rifle, clicked on his flashlight, and crawled into the cave entrance. Behind him, Private First Class Henry Nakamura, a Nisei interpreter from California, followed with a bag of rations and medical supplies. No order had authorized this approach. It was improvisation born from moral necessity, the same impulse that had driven Gabaldon to walk toward the cliffs with a loudspeaker instead of a weapon. The tunnel narrowed, forcing Reed to crawl on his stomach. Water dripped from the ceiling. The air smelled of unwashed bodies and fear. 30 feet in, his flashlight beam found them, 2 women, an elderly man, and 4 children pressed against the far wall of a chamber. One woman held a grenade, her finger near the pin. Reed stopped moving. He raised his empty hands slowly, keeping the flashlight pointed at the ground to avoid blinding them. Nakamura began speaking in Japanese, using the same calm conversational tone Gabaldon had discovered was more persuasive than formal commands. Minutes passed. Reed held perfectly still while Nakamura talked, explaining that they meant no harm, that children needed food and water, that survival wasn't shameful. Slowly, Reed reached into his pack and pulled out a tin of peaches. He set it on the cave floor and pushed it forward with his fingertips, then retreated. The youngest child, a girl perhaps 5 years old, stared at the can. Hunger eventually overcame terror. She reached out and pulled it close. 20 minutes later, the family emerged into daylight. Navy corpsmen waiting outside immediately began treating dehydration and malnutrition. The girl who had taken the peaches clutched a chocolate bar, her face showing the cognitive dissonance of receiving kindness from the monsters she'd been taught to fear. Reed realized that this single rescue represented lessons that would define cave operations in future Pacific battles. At Okinawa, 10 months later, American forces would formalize these improvised mercy missions, training units specifically in unarmed cave rescue techniques. But not every cave encounter ended in rescue. That same afternoon, Marines approaching a different cave complex were met with grenade explosions from within, families completing their suicide pacts before Americans could reach them. Some caves contained mixed groups where Japanese soldiers prevented civilian surrender, shooting families who attempted to leave. The ambiguity was deadly. Marines couldn't know if a sealed cave held terrified children or armed defenders preparing an ambush. Throughout mid-July, as organized resistance ended and the island was declared secure, cave-clearing operations continued. Some Marines made unauthorized choices to enter unarmed with food and flashlights. Others followed doctrine and used explosives, discovering too late that they had killed the people they might have saved. The individual moral choices of young soldiers, men barely older than 20 deciding in split seconds whether to risk their lives for enemy civilians, prevented additional tragedies. But they couldn't prevent them all. The final accounting would show that hundreds were saved from caves while hundreds more died in them, and the difference often came down to which Marine unit reached which cave first, and whether that unit's commander was willing to ignore the tactical manual in favor of human conscience. Throughout mid-July, as organized resistance ended and the island was declared secure, cave-clearing operations continued. Some Marines made unauthorized choices to enter unarmed with food and flashlights. Others followed doctrine and used explosives, discovering too late that they had killed the people they might have saved. The individual moral choices of young soldiers, men barely older than 20, deciding in split seconds whether to risk their lives for enemy civilians, prevented additional tragedies. But they couldn't prevent them all. The final accounting would show that hundreds were saved from caves while hundreds more died in them, and the difference often came down to which Marine unit reached which cave first, and whether that unit's commander was willing to ignore the tactical manual in favor of human conscience. July the 9th, 1944. 300 yards from where Guy Gabaldon was convincing families to surrender, Japanese Army Lieutenant Takeshi Yamada stood among the rocks with his pistol drawn. He had watched for 2 days as American loudspeakers convinced civilians to betray their duty. Now a family of 4 was descending from the cliff area responding to the appeals. Yamada raised his weapon and fired 3 shots. The father fell first, then the mother. The children screamed and ran back toward the cliffs. Yamada was enforcing orders that made mercy into treason. The Senjinkan, the field service code issued to every Imperial Japanese soldier on January 8, 1941, was explicit. Never live to experience shame as a prisoner. The code forbade surrender under any circumstances, elevating death to the supreme virtue and survival to the ultimate dishonor. But the Senjinkan created a particular cruelty when applied to civilians. Japanese military doctrine viewed civilian surrender as a stain on national honor, evidence that the empire's subjects lacked the resolve to fight to extinction. Officers like Yamada had received explicit orders from higher command: prevent civilian capitulation by any means necessary. Japanese commanders believed that mass civilian suicide would demonstrate national determination, that it would demoralize American forces and prove that Japan would never submit to occupation. Allowing civilians to surrender contradicted this strategic calculation. Therefore, Japanese soldiers were ordered to shoot their own people to prevent them from accepting American mercy. The system created impossible moral positions. Japanese soldiers who showed compassion towards civilians faced court-martial and execution for dereliction of duty. Post-war tribunal testimony, preserved in the International Military Tribunal for the Far East Archives, documented cases where Japanese officers executed their own subordinates for allowing civilian surrender. The military code transformed individual conscience into prosecutable treason. Soldiers were trapped between their natural human empathy and a totalitarian system that demanded they suppress it. But not all Japanese soldiers obeyed. Private Hiroshi Nakamura stood guard at a cave entrance near Marpi Point when a Nisei interpreter's voice echoed across the rocks, calling for civilians to emerge. Nakamura heard movement inside the cave. His orders were clear: shoot anyone attempting to surrender. His officer watched from 30 yards away. When the cave's occupants began emerging, 2 women and 3 children, Nakamura raised his rifle and fired 3 rounds. All 3 shots missed, striking rock several feet from the civilians. He chambered another round, fired again, missed again. By the time his officer ran forward to take direct control, the family had reached American lines. Nakamura would carry that act of deliberate disobedience for the rest of his life, documented in testimony he gave decades later to Japanese historians studying the battle. He had violated every principle of the Senjin-kun, committed treason against military orders, and saved 5 lives by pretending incompetence. Other Japanese soldiers made similar choices. Some deliberately fired warning shots to give civilians time to escape. Some claimed their weapons malfunctioned at critical moments. Some simply turned away when families fled toward American positions, choosing selective blindness over enforcement. These acts of individual conscience occurred within a system designed to make them impossible. The tragedy was that most Japanese soldiers, bound by years of indoctrination and immediate fear of punishment, followed their orders. They shot civilians attempting to surrender. They forced families to complete suicide pacts. They turned protective duty into executioner's work because the alternative meant their own execution. Lieutenant Yamada survived the battle and was captured by American forces on July 12th. During post-war interrogation, he described his actions at the cliffs with neither pride nor remorse, simply stating that he had followed orders as required by the Senjin-kun. When asked if he understood that he had killed Japanese civilians, he replied that they had ceased being civilians when they chose surrender over death. The propaganda had worked on both sides of the equation, on the civilians who believed Americans were monsters, and on the soldiers who believed that preventing surrender was duty rather than murder. The battle officially ended on July 9th, but suicides continued throughout the following week. In isolated caves and cliff areas beyond the reach of loudspeakers, families completed the suicide pacts they had been taught to make. Some Japanese soldiers, cut off from command and unwilling to surrender themselves, enforced the final dictates of propaganda on the last civilians they encountered. The killing continued even after the fighting stopped, casualties not of combat, but of an ideology that had made death seem more honorable than survival. The battle officially ended on July 9th, but suicides continued throughout the following week. In isolated caves and cliff areas beyond the reach of loudspeakers, families completed the suicide pacts they had been taught to make. Some Japanese soldiers, cut off from command and unwilling to surrender themselves, enforced the final dictates of propaganda on the last civilians they encountered. The killing continued even after the fighting stopped, casualties not of combat, but of an ideology that had made death seem more honorable than survival. Late July 1944, Camp Susupe, southern Saipan. A processing center for civilian survivors stretched across former sugarcane fields, rows of tents housing families who had emerged from caves and descended from cliffs. 12-year-old Michiko Sugano sat outside a tent with her younger brother, both holding tins of rations distributed by Navy corpsmen. For 3 weeks, she had believed Americans would torture her if captured. Now she watched those same Americans distribute food, treat wounds, and carry water. The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming. Everything she had been taught was a lie, and that realization felt almost as traumatic as the battle itself. The final accounting was devastating. Conservative estimates documented at least 8,000 Japanese civilian deaths on Saipan out of approximately 30,000 inhabitants, a casualty rate of over 26%. Some historical analyses suggest the number reached 10,000 or higher. Approximately 1,000 civilians died in the mass suicides at Suicide Cliff and Banzai Cliff during the battle's final days. Thousands more died from artillery, bombing, or in caves that were destroyed before rescue operations could reach them. But roughly 14,000 to 15,000 civilians survived, many directly because of American rescue efforts. The difference between death and survival often came down to timing. Whether a loudspeaker team reached a particular cliff before a family jumped, whether a Marine decided to crawl into a cave with food instead of clearing it with grenades. The psychological rehabilitation of survivors became as important as their physical care. American occupation authorities established schools in the civilian camps, teaching children that the atrocity stories had been propaganda. They allowed families to witness the respectful treatment of Japanese prisoners of war, providing visual proof that surrender didn't mean torture. Gradually, trust began replacing terror. Navy corpsmen who treated civilian injuries became the most effective counter-propaganda. Their actions spoke louder than any official pronouncement could. Saipan's lessons fundamentally changed American psychological warfare doctrine for subsequent Pacific operations. When Marines assaulted Tinian in late July 1944, they deployed Nisei, interpreter teams from the invasion's first day. At Guam in August, loudspeaker operations and safe conduct passes were integrated into assault planning rather than improvised afterward. By the time American forces reached Okinawa in April 1945, the systematic rescue approach pioneered at Saipan had become official doctrine. Caves were approached with food and interpreters before explosives, civilian collection points were established behind advancing lines, and safe conduct leaflets were dropped by the millions. Guy Gabaldon continued his unauthorized rescue missions throughout the remainder of the Saipan campaign, eventually bringing in an estimated 1,500 prisoners and rescued civilians. He was awarded the Silver Star, though many who witnessed his actions believed he deserved the Medal of Honor. His legacy lived in every Pacific battle afterward, proof that individual moral courage could save hundreds of lives, and that street-learned Japanese could be more effective than military translation in breaking through propaganda's walls. The cost of propaganda's power to transform protective love into mass death would haunt both American and Japanese veterans for decades. Marines who watched families jump from cliffs carried those images for life. Japanese civilians who survived struggled with guilt, wondering if their choice to live had been shameful. Some Japanese soldiers who enforced suicide orders later committed suicide themselves, unable to reconcile what they had done with who they believed they were. But the story also contained evidence that human conscience could resist even the most systematic indoctrination. American Marines who chose to crawl into caves unarmed rather than follow tactical doctrine. Japanese soldiers who deliberately missed their shots to allow civilian escapes. Nisei interpreters who used their bicultural understanding to bridge the gap between propaganda and reality. These individual acts of courage, scattered across 3 weeks of horror, proved that totalitarian systems couldn't entirely extinguish moral choice. Today, at Marpi Point and Banzai Cliff, memorial stones stand inscribed with names in both Japanese and English. Survivors and their descendants gather there annually to honor both the dead who believed the lies and the living who chose mercy. The cliffs remain as they were in 1944, volcanic rock falling 800 feet to churning surf below. But the silence that now surrounds them is different from the silence of July 1944. It's a silence of remembrance rather than terror, a space where visitors can reflect on what happens when governments weaponize fear and what it means when individual human beings refuse to accept that weaponization as inevitable.